Now, the idea of the war in Ukraine is very much about what will happen next. It affects the world. Will there be negotiations or not? What will Trump's impact be once he assumes office? These are the questions we're going to be discussing now with our guests. I'm delighted to be joined by Eugeniusz Smolar, who is the Senior Fellow at the Center for International Relations and former Director of the Polish section, BBC World Service. Now, in recent weeks, there's been much talk about negotiations with Russia and Ukraine about ending the war. There have been loud voices on different sides of the aisle, but is there really a willingness of Vladimir Putin to now sit down and negotiate?
How would we know? I mean, the situation in the front is favorable to his ambitions, and his ambitions are very well known because they announced them publicly. To take over Ukraine, denazified it, that means change of government, and the Ukrainians in their blood, in their historical memory, they remember what does it mean. So they are fighting heroically, and the upper hand with the Russian army seems to have at the moment in the East Donbass. It's not overwhelming, but it is significant, creates a certain feeling of uneasiness on Ukrainian side, and especially on the side of the Western supporters of Ukraine. Putin would have a strong incentive to engage in the serious negotiation only if the United States and the European Union, NATO, would have something significant to offer. And his ambitions are to go back in history to the 1989, 1991, that means dissolution of the Soviet Union and the loss of influence over the large chunk of Europe. This is not going to happen. That was rejected by the West. So there won't be any incentive. The economic cooperation between Russia and the West is insignificant in trade terms, industrial terms. Russia has nothing to offer but oil and gas. So the only incentive would be really on the Western side. Because, I mean, this is tiring. There's a loss of blood, loss of tax money. The public opinion is growingly dissatisfied with the level of support when the domestic needs are so obvious, social needs, economic needs. So there is a bit of a pressure from both sides, but I believe, going back to your question, that on the side of Putin, it's not honest. It hides his ambitions and his intentions.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned also parts of the terms that Putin wants to have, what he calls as denazification of Ukraine. He wants a demilitarized Ukraine. He wants a weak Ukraine with no combat power, no allegiances to any Western alliances, the EU, NATO. As you said, this is not an honest broker. So is there even any, let's say, sense in sitting down on equal terms? As you said, the West has to give something, but would anything really be feasible at this point? And if we look at the arms of Russia continuing more and more defense spending, far more actually than the United States, I mean, Putin is showing us he's not really interested here in slowing down at all, is he?
Well, we don't know. When you deal with the autocratic regimes, and this is what history have taught us, you never know how strong or how weak they really are until the moment of crisis. All the economic analysis, whether Russian or Western, suggests that Russia is economically weak. And the fact that out of this budget, which is much smaller than it was only 3 years ago, because of the cut of import of gas and oil, this proves that this armament drive and the fact that something like 40% of the national budget goes for the military, it's not something which you can compare with the strength of the Western alliance, especially of the United States. Something which might suggest that some kind of negotiations could be on foot is something which in Poland, in the Baltic state, in Ukraine itself, is not being considered as a serious threat. It's a nuclear aspect. People do not realize that since 1945, especially when the Soviet Union achieved parity, nuclear parity with the United States in the 70s, the policy of the United States was consistent. On one hand, deterrence, and on the other hand, negotiations, which led to some disarmament treaties, agreements. Well, this is all in shambles now. So it is in the interest of the United States to act in the sort of atmosphere of predictability when nuclear policy is concerned. And we know that Putin has threatened on several occasions to use a tactical nuclear weapon. And the Western policymakers have to pay attention to it, not because he might do it, because, you know, the tactical nuclear weapon effect would be something like 3 football fields. It wouldn't be that significant, but the shock in the Western societies, whether particularly in Europe, but also in the United States, would be such that there would be a growing pressure of the public opinion on the policymakers to make a deal. So this is something which Putin, I have no doubt, counts on, because it corresponds to the United States' traditional policies, nuclear policies. And we must realize that however happy in Poland we are because of our treaties, security treaties with the United States has not been conducting Polish policy or Ukrainian policy. It has been conducting Russia policy, Russia first policy. We hate this notion, but this is a simple truth. The United States, like any nation state, cares most of all about its own security. And I would not like to leave the day when the United States have to choose between Washington and Warsaw.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of the United States, with Donald Trump returning to the White House very, very soon, he has promised that this war between Russia and Ukraine would cease in 24 hours. He would make that possible. Recently he said that might take more time, maybe 6 months. It seems that he's being pushed in a different sort of narrative. Is he realizing now that this is not a simple, quick fix? Is he going to, in your mind, stop funding to Ukraine at this pivotal time? What do you make of his now reappearance on the world stage as president, and which way it's going to impact this terrible war?
Well, the international relations has been for some time under the weather of unpredictability. And the Trump factor is one of the gravest and the most important one. I do not pay all that much attention to what he says or bubbles or tweets or whatever. But he must have realized after the initial contacts with Moscow that this is not going to happen. So he gives himself more time because he doesn't want to lose face, and he's a winner. Under his policies of making a deal, deal-making policy, as his book title suggests, he is a winner in his own eyes. There is no win, there is no policy. So I think we are to wait for some moves. There is a talk that there might be a meeting between Trump and Putin. And that should worry us, remembering how they met in Helsinki, face-to-face only, when he announced afterward that he trusts Putin more than his own security agencies. We just don't know. And we need to look carefully, but not at the words, but at the sort of context in which happens. And the context is not international. It is Trump's own public opinion. Expects him to be tough, expects him to be winning. And in that context, look at his pronouncement concerning the future of Greenland, Canada, and Panama Canal.
He's also said he's vehemently against using long-range weapons into Russian territory, but he hasn't ruled that out in terms of actually on Ukrainian territory. So is this, again, you say we have to judge him by his actions, but if we look back at his policies, He was one of the first to deliver javelins back when he was president. Is there hope that he would continue supporting Ukraine? I mean, it's ultimately also a win for the United States to keep Ukraine sovereign, to keep Ukraine more on the Western side, isn't it?
We don't know. I remember President Obama, sarcastically I would add, the Peace Nobel Prize laureate, who said that Ukraine always will be more important to Russia than to the United States. And I believe Trump believes exactly the same. But he hates losing. And if there will be people around him who will persuade him that he will lose politically and he will lose face, that might influence his behavior. But I stress the word behavior. But behavior, fears and hopes, this is not a policy. This is not a strategy.
So we'll have to see how that goes. The world will watch with anticipation what Donald Trump will do as we move forward. Thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it.
Pleasure.
And thank you for watching. I was Sasha Farbach for TVP World.